Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Doughty Street Chambers. We're just back from Geneva, where we have been filing this petition on the part of Lula against the government of Brazil. Now, in fact, the Olympic Games, which open a week today, are more threatened not by the Zika virus or violence in the favelas, but by the anticipated, expected, hoped for arrest of Lula, the former president of Brazil, by one Judge Moro. This is a hypothetical event, although widely anticipated by the local press, which reflects an enormously important legal political struggle in Brazil, and yet a struggle that has been barely reported at all by the British press. We've heard endlessly about kidnapping and violence and mosquitoes. We've heard nothing, virtually, Financial Times and Guardian, perhaps one article, about this extraordinary consequence of something called Operation Car Wash. So, before introducing our distinguished panel, I am going to seek to set the scene for, indeed, our petition to Geneva. Lula is not, as many think, yesterday's pop singer, but is the president, was the president between 2003 and 2010 of this enormous country, this democracy of 200 million people. Extraordinarily, and this is why he is an icon to workers around the world, he started from a dysfunctional family selling peanuts on the streets at the age of 8. He only ever did one exam at 16 to enable him to become a lathe worker. And there he worked on lathes for years. And it had, I suppose, this advantage that he never took on any of the isms of the 60s, Stalinism or Trotskyism or communism. All he cared about, all he's ever cared about, it seems to me, politically, was the welfare of workers, how to improve their condition and how to help their human rights. And when he became, finally, the president of Brazil, he achieved that and is credited by objective viewers of lifting about 40 million people out of poverty, and credited with one program which the United Nations puts around the world today, a program that involved payments to women if they had their children immunized and educated and so forth. I won't go into details, but he has, for that reason and others, become an icon. He had his disputes with George W. Bush over Iraq. He refused and indeed denounced the invasion of Iraq, but otherwise they got on in ways that America hasn't got on with other Latin American leaders, although he was careful to support them. Well, that is Lula. What about Brazilian law? The law that we are concerned about has two striking features. It is unreformed inquisitorial law. Now, dating from the Spanish Inquisition, but it has been reformed in Europe, not in Latin America, particularly not in Brazil. What it the two areas that are most concerned. The first is it sets up as a kind of prosecutor judge, one judge who is involved from beginning to end. This judge is the authorizes all the investigative procedures. He determines the strength that there's enough suspicion to telephone tap, to arrest, and then he turns around and acts as the trial judge. Now, in many cases, this is preposterous because he becomes totally biased against the suspect in the course of listening to his telephone calls and writing judgments that he's under suspicion and needs to be investigated and indeed needs to be arrested. And this whole process was changed thanks to the European Convention. It was changed in a case in which I was involved in 1988 called Hausschulte against Denmark. Denmark had this system where judges, where the same judge sitting in the investigative stage would deny bail for a defendant, and then on the grounds that he was likely to be convicted, and then turn around and convict him. And what the European Court of Human Rights said is no, the inquisitorial system cannot work like this. You have to separate the function of the police function, acting as a policeman and a prosecutor and tapping phones and so on, from the judicial function. The judge must be impartial. He mustn't get involved in the case. So that's the first issue. The second legal issue is the power in Brazil and other South American countries that does not permit bail, the power to lock suspects up indefinitely. And extraordinarily, in Brazil, you have several thousand unconvicted prisoners who are locked up indefinitely before their trial. So this is an issue that is raised in this petition, and it's been a matter of great concern to human rights organizations and to United Nations bodies. The idea that a prosecutor or a prosecuting judge can lock up a suspect or a defendant until they confess, until they plea bargain. And as we'll see, this has been a phenomenon in what is called Operation Car Wash. The suspects are arrested and locked up until they confess. And obviously, those confessions are unreliable because there's pressure on the individual to confess in order to get out of prison. Now, the next thing we've got to consider is corruption in Brazil, because there has been quite a lot. Not as much as the press, the local press makes out. The objective study this year found that, according to Transparency International, Brazil came 67th in terms of corruption. Not good, but nonetheless not as bad as the other BRICS countries, China and India and Russia. So, yes, there is a considerable amount of has been a degree of corruption. It's not a new phenomenon. It's been there since certainly before the army junta took over in 1964. But corruption there is, and it's a very important thing to eradicate corruption, to prosecute those who are corrupt. But that has to be done fairly. If it's not done fairly, then all sorts of things would happen. There was a corruption, a clean-up, crusading prosecutor back in Italy in the 90s who tried to get Mr. Craxi and Mr. Andreotti and ended up that particular operation, Clean Hands, was a disaster because it ended up with its main suspect as Prime Minister, one Silvio Berlusconi. So you've got to be careful in prosecuting corruption. The way that it's done properly in Hong Kong and Singapore, in Sydney, in New Zealand, in Tanzania, is to set up what is called an ICAC, an independent Commission Against Corruption, which ensures that corruption is investigated effectively but also fairly. But that isn't the case in Brazil. By happenstance, when some money was found within a particular lower court judge's, really a magistrate's jurisdiction, that magistrate assumed the conduct of the entire proceedings. And that magistrate was one Sergio Moro. Now, in order to consider whether this is, and whether his crusade is proper, we have to say a little about this magistrate. He's a man who has long urged an anti-corruption crusade in Brazil on the lines of the rather discredited Italian operation in the 90s, the Clean Hands operation. Well, that's fine. No one objects to having someone in favor of crusades, but this judge had an interesting theory, and a dangerous theory. He said that politicians had to be demonized and delegitimized. He said that the public had to be whipped up to against politicians, and he spoke with delight at how Mr. Craxey's house had been stoned by an angry populace, whipped up by prosecution allegations that were leaked to the media. And that is something that is all right, a view that is quite open to a crusading prosecutor, but very odd and very uncomfortable and very wrong when, as we shall see, it becomes the mantra and the belief of a judge, an impartial judge. So, where are we? You'll hear that Mr. Moro, a judge, has taken over the investigation of Lula. Now, Lula has retired. He's retired in 2010. He lives off his earnings as a lecturer, and he lives in very modest circumstances. But according to the investigation, there are 3 questions. There's no evidence that he took backhanders or kickbacks in the period when he was president. No evidence at all. But the 3 issues that are being investigated are, first, whether after retirement he was given the lease or given the opportunity to use a country house which was owned by some rich Brazilian friends. Well, that's not unusual for politicians. And Lula simply says, I don't own it. I was just allowed to use it at weekends by these wealthy friends. What's corrupt about that? Well, that's the first area, the country house. And then it's suggested that he might be owner of an apartment that overlooks a rather second-rate beach. Well, that's he was interested in buying it. He went there, he says, but he has no ownership at all of it. And that is the end of that. And thirdly, it said that his lectures, he's given 40 lectures for money, he's given many lectures free. But it said that because some of the corrupt companies corporations, building companies, have paid him for those lectures, that might have been some sort of quid pro quo. But of course he's given lectures for Microsoft, and he's given lectures even for El Globo, which is his main hostile media. So that's about all that the prosecution amount to. And what has, and I should explain that there does the particular kind of corruption that we're dealing with in Operation Car Wash is a cartel. under Lula's presidency, Brazil did very well. Its wealth increased, it became very prosperous. That was, of course, partly the economic climate. But the greed of a group of construction companies, 5 of them, it waxed considerable, and they seem to have ripped off Petrobras, the state oil and petrol company, and by a complicated means that I don't need to go into, but they allowed a degree of political and financial corruption that affected a large number of political parties. One of the problems in Brazil is that the president's popularity generally outruns that of his party, and governments are coalition governments with up to 10 parties, and there are opportunities for corrupt members of parliament and corrupt parliamentary staff to take kickbacks, and that has been a feature of Brazil politics for a long time, and obviously it needs to be stamped out, but it needs to be stamped out fairly. What has happened, however, is that this particular operation, instead of going to an independent commission which acts fairly, has gone entirely to Judge Moro, attended by prosecutors and police, with whom he is really hand in glove. He doesn't do any work other than it's a one-man corruption inquiry, and he spends his time approving, not rubber stamping, but by writing judgments in favor of taking action against Lula. What he's done is this. For example, he has ordered Lula's telephone to be tapped. Then he's ordered the telephones belonging to Lula's family members to be tapped. And then he ordered the telephones of Lula's lawyer and his law firm to be tapped as well, so that he could hear the conversations between Lula and his lawyer. Then, not content with that, he decides to release to the press, the right-wing press, which is hostile to Lula and the Workers' Party, the transcripts, full of scuttlebutt and so forth, and embarrassing statements of the kind you make over the telephone. That's all released to the public, not only in transcript form, but in audio tapes, so that they can play them for the delectation of their readers and then viewers. And then, he goes even further. Some of the tapes were illegally manufactured because his writ, his authorization of the telephone tapping ran out at 11 o'clock, and they kept the tapes rolling illegally until 3 o'clock. And on those tapes were discussions between Lula and Dilma Rousseff, the president. Well, Moro couldn't resist, given his obsession, seemingly, with obtaining publicity for himself and whipping up the public. He released those illegal tapes to the media so that it would create a political sensation. That is the one of the features of this case is that there is no remedy for Lula in Brazil, but that is at least one action that was condemned by the Supreme Court. What sort of independent... And this is the judge who will have Lula arrested, so it's widely expected, and will then decide alone. Judges in Brazil sit without a jury. That's one man who has done these outrageous violations of Lula's privacy and his family's privacy, will now turn around and decide whether he's guilty or innocent. That could never happen in Britain. You couldn't, it's like a judge at the Old Bailey taking off his wig, authorizing surveillance operations, widespread telephone tapping, then authorizing the Daily Mail to publish all the details and the Sky Television to broadcast the audio tapes, and then putting his wig back on and deciding whether Lula is guilty or innocent. This is outrageous. It is a gross violation of the most fundamental right to fair trial. But it goes further. The interesting thing, as I've said, is that in Operation Car Wash, Judge Morrow not only arrests those that he thinks might be guilty, he then turns around, on the basis that they're likely to be guilty, he then turns around and convicts them because he's the trial judge, after they've spent, some of them, months, I think one of them 12 months in prison, told that they have to stay there until they confess. And then he does what is called a plea bargain. He sentences them to a long time, 20 years in prison, and then they get released in a few months because they've confessed and maybe incriminated others. So this is the way Operation Car Wash is going. But at the end of the day, what is exposed by these extraordinary shenanigans of Judge Morrow, and it goes rather further. I don't know whether you can see the picture on the right. There is Judge Morrow smiling happily because he's launching a book about himself, Operation Car Wash. This is June the 21st, only a few weeks ago. The book is written by the journalist on the right, who's a journalist for Il Globo, the Lula's great adversary. And on the other side is a woman who's the journalist's mother and a commentator on television who's famous for condemning Lula. So here is Judge Morrow with a book. And the report of this extraordinary book launch explains that everyone applauds Morrow as he comes in. He sits down and he signs copies of the book, a book that he hasn't written, a book that is a hagiography of himself, a book which is devoted to lauding him to the skies, and has a whole chapter accusing Lula, demonizing Lula, defaming Lula. This is the extent to which the country has been reduced. You get these fan magazines. There is the judge with his best Eliot Ness pose, and there's 70 pages of hagiography comparing him to Judge Sirica and others, and setting himself up. And he seems to love this. He likes being applauded. He likes having fans as if he were a TV star. Well, that's all very well for a prosecutor. I don't mind anti-crusading prosecutors. They can, so long as, before anyone goes to jail on their suspicions or their allegations, they come up before an independent and impartial judge. That is the most fundamental right of anyone who is accused. It is the most fundamental of human rights. And in Brazil, it's a laughingstock, because of this publicity-obsessed judge who is clearly partisan, who has not only conducted these lawless telephone tapping attacks on Lula and his family, but is also, and some of those pictures concern an illegal bench warrant. You can't issue a bench warrant in Brazil until the suspect has refused to be interrogated. Lula has never refused. He's gone to talk to the police and prosecutors 6 times over the last year. And there you can see him on the bottom left. They That's the lift in his little apartment. They are the police who came with a bench warrant signed by Judge Morrow, who must have known that he couldn't issue a bench warrant in these circumstances, and dragged Lula off to an airport an hour away, and there you see the crowds who were tipped off demonstrating against him, and there he is at the top after that 4-hour interrogation. This is no way to treat, and it's not the fact that he's a former president, it's the fact that he's a human being. This is no way to treat someone who's a cooperative witness, but that is how Judge Morrow is treating him. So here we are on the eve of the Olympics, and it's richly ironic, isn't it, that it was Lula who won the Olympics for his country, not able to attend, I gather, what should have been his something that he was able to attend because of the extraordinary behavior of this judge. And this judge is abusing and using the law of Brazil, which is unreformed inquisitorial law. It's been reformed throughout Europe. Of course, Brazil was settled by the Portuguese and speaks the Portuguese language. In Portugal, this could not happen. In no country in Europe since 1988 could this happen, of the judge playing the policeman and prosecutor and then turning around and convicting his own suspect. But it's happening in Brazil, where people, over 2,000, according to the latest human rights organizations' estimates, are being held without trial until, in many cases, they confess. So it is a time, and it is perhaps appropriate, since it was Lula who, in 2009, ratified the Human Rights Convention and ratified the right of the Human Rights Committee to investigate. It is appropriate that he should take these two motes in Brazil's eye, these two aspects of its failure in terms of human rights, and regrettably they are failures that he has come to feel through the behavior of those opposed to him. This conspiracy of policemen, prosecutors, and judge who leak all they can find that is to the media, which is opposed to him. And this aspect of Brazil, which every Brazilian knows about, but which has not been publicized to the rest of the world, will perhaps become more evident as a result of this petition. Well, that is what I want to say by way of background. Of course, Lula is defended, and being defended very well, by lawyers who are themselves subject to a great deal of hostility. But I would now invite Cristiano Martins, who is one of Lula's leading lawyers, to come and tell you about what he has experienced, and Daisy Quentel could come and interpret for us.